I'm Brian Kelly, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. And I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union, and encourage you to visit consumerscu.org to learn more. All right. So Brian, yesterday the Federal Reserve met. Can you fill us in on what happened there?
Yeah, pretty big news. And of course, the Federal Reserve comes on the heels. The Federal Reserve meeting comes on the heels of the monthly update on inflation, which shows that it continues to cool down. So the rate of increase in pricing is slower than what it had previously been, and it's not at their target yet, but it's actually getting within sights of it. So the core inflation is starting to come down, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Actually, we're going to do a year-end kind of data. Data Thursday, I guess it won't be on Monday, but Thursday, which would be the last small business briefing of the month, we're going to cover kind of where we stand here as we head toward the close of the year. And so just talk, more comprehensive look. So we're not going to be looking at the data today, but if we were, you would see that that inflation has continued to come down. So that doesn't mean prices went down, but they're rising at a more normal pace, about 3%. Core inflation a little higher than that, but also core inflation trends are slower to come down, but still heading in the right direction. They've gotten to a point, though, even though decrease in gas prices and actually food consumed in the home in particular, those two categories that can bounce up and down a lot, both of them have a lot to do with the inflation number overall coming down, but just the totality of it clearly has changed the mood of the Federal Reserve. We saw a very different projection. Previously, the Federal Reserve seemed like they were going out of their way to establish expectations that the work wasn't done, that further rate cuts or rate increases might be required. It was a total 180 on that yesterday. So the chair of the Federal Reserve actually set very clear expectations of rate cuts next year. In fact, projections of 3 reductions in interest rates next year. So what will happen is immediately long-term rates drop, because that gets priced in right away. So like when you're looking at longer-term borrowing rates, the Federal Reserve doesn't actually have to take the steps of decreasing them. If the market believes that it's going to happen, it'll get priced into the long-term rates. In the short term, nothing changes. So if you've got a line of credit or something that is tied to prime rate of interest, prime +1 or set at prime interest rate, that's tied back to the rate that the Federal Reserve sets. Nothing will change now, but that forecast made a big difference. And the equities markets have kind of gone bonkers since then. I mean, really big week on Wall Street this week. So if you don't make a regular habit of looking at your investment portfolios or your 401k, because it's up and down, and you don't need to put yourself through that type of stress, but it might be a happy time to look at it right now, because it has been one heck of a few days since this data has come out, and the Federal Reserve confirmed that the monetary tightening policies are at their peak, and now they're expecting and establishing expectations that rates will decrease. By the way, of course, you never know what's happening in the mind of another person, but my impression is that the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, Jerome Powell, has to be very, very sure, tries to limit expectations, and so to essentially establish expectations of rate cuts means he must be very, very confident that that's what we're looking at next year.
All right. Well, thanks for the report there. I want to talk a little bit about the Growing Michigan Together Council. Brian, you sit on this council, and this morning, the final recommendations were released. So I'm hoping you can give us some highlights into that report.
Yeah, it's quite an extensive report, and we'll share with you, a link and how you can get to it and take a look at it. Basically, it breaks down recommendations on growing Michigan in the future. It's really talked about population growth, but population growth is tied into people doing well and the economy doing well and our communities doing well. That's, those things make the population grow. So really, that's where the recommendations focused in on. There were some earlier releases of, I'll say like draft reports, but really they were just kind of catching all the different things that have been talked about from work groups and things and putting them all in one place. It was never the stuff that you saw news on before today was never really a good representation of the recommendations. They've really been refined into three overarching strategies. And the first is on the economy and economic development. It's about Michigan being a scale up state, the kind of place where innovation and growth are the objective. And that might sound weird because you think, wait, don't you need to attract new in um, in order to gain more population? Well, the first step to growing is to stop shrinking. And to stop shrinking, that means we need to keep the people that we have here. We need the people that are here to be doing better, to have more opportunity, to have a better life. And that's a better building block to grow on rather than saying to the rest of the world, hey, we're behind on per capita income, we're behind on our education system, but join us, right? That really doesn't fly. We have to start there. And what I really liked about the economic development section is that there's a very strong inference that the key thing, the main thing, the first thing at least, is that the people that are already here have to be doing well. So it's about removing obstacles for those that are on the ground already to be successful. And those on the ground already, people like our members that have already put a bet down in Michigan. Michigan is where your business is. The Now the second is education, and it is very, very clear that states that have strong education systems are the states um, that are growing in population and household income is higher and poverty rates are lower. Just educational attainment, starting with the bedrock of the K-12 system is important. But what I liked about this report is that it didn't reach for any shiny objects, and it doesn't like cherry pick out different aspects of educational reform. Really, what it says is that it needs to that the change needs to be very comprehensive. It has to hit the idea of funding, making it to students in ways that are relevant to their needs. Some kids, like for example, kids in special education, it just costs more to help a child with a developmental disability reach their full potential. We have to have a system that recognizes and provides the expertise and the funding in order to ensure that kids that have bigger challenges have the resources that they need. That's intuitive. I mean, I think people would really get that, but it also is about the standards. What is expected? What are the competencies that somebody needs leaving when they leave the primary education system and go on to the next stage in their life? In other words, how well are they prepared for the next thing, whatever it is that they go on to in their life? Today, our education system is still performing like it did years ago, and while it is doing what it was designed to do, what it was designed to do is not meeting the needs of our people or our economy today. So there's the standards, but then there has to be accountability behind those standards. So funding, standards, accountability of those standards, that these things are not independent of each other. They all have to be done. And then you put on top of it some governance recommendations. Right now, the State Board of Education, the governor's office, the legislature, policymaking, appropriations, these things are so separate from each other that there's no real coherence. And so governance would be the fourth leg of that stool when it comes to the education recommendations. And it's really important that when policymakers receive this report, that they don't look at it like it's a menu. Oh, I like this and I like that. But this education reform, all of these things have to be done. They work together, and none of them will work as well as our students need and our future economy needs if they don't look at them as being one recommendation as opposed to a series of recommendations. So education is really important, central to it. And then and it is featured on what's called an education guarantee. And I think the layout of that section is really quite nice. The the other part, or the third part, is about our communities, vibrant cities where people can, where there's housing that people can, that is available and where people can afford. I mean, the nuts and bolts, transportation, getting around. It does lean into transit, which I know sometimes people are look sideways at transit systems. But particularly in crowded and congested areas, they're really important to have well-working transit systems. And in Michigan, we've never had well-working transit systems. I mean, in most places, they don't either have the scale or the infrastructure in place or the reliability where people want to use them. I know that even though I don't use any transit systems in Michigan. When I travel around the world or travel to other big cities, I always do. So it's one of those things where I wouldn't use a system that didn't work well. Well, in Michigan, we've not had well-working systems in the past. In other places, they figured this out. But I think it would do a disservice to this. Well, I think some people probably will grab it out and say, "Oh, the city thing is transit." No, that's one piece of the overall picture. And so I think you really have to look at these um, under the under each umbrella. They're kind of like North Stars or overarching strategies that are going to have lots of components and moving pieces that are underneath them. But it's a plan, and it's been a while since our state has had, I'd say especially since the pandemic, for the state to get its footing and what are we about? What direction do we want to go? I think this is a great contender. Policymakers still have to do something with it, right? This is a report, they're words on a piece of paper. Somebody needs to make those words on a piece of paper come to life. So while I didn't like every single word in the report, certainly nobody did. There was a very diverse group of stakeholders that came together, but in its totality, they're the right priorities and I think kind of a logical layout of what the needs are and some of the impediments to our growth have been.
All right, so just a couple of follow-up questions. You just said there were some things you didn't like, but what are you most excited about in this report?
Yeah, I'd have to say that the education system, the education proposal, the education guarantee, is the thing that has me most excited. And the reason that I'm most excited about it is that this is now the second group of diverse and smart stakeholders from a very wide cross section of society that's come together and come to largely the same conclusions that we, as part of the Launch Michigan Coalition, have come to. So when I look at this, at the education recommendations, it very closely matches the the policy direction that SBAM and our members have adopted when it comes to that primary education system. So whether a kid goes off to college, they become an entrepreneur, join the military, um, or do any number of things um, after high school, the that fundamental building block is necessary, and we've been falling behind. So the idea that this was well aligned with SBAM's education policy objectives, well aligned with Launch Michigan's, kind of an independent confirmation, if you will, of the work that Launch Michigan did originally. Um, I think gives a lot of credibility and some potential momentum behind it. So I'm hopeful that this one, that number one, it doesn't collect dust on everybody's desk, but number two, that policymakers truly do look at it and say, we have to do all of these things. We can't just pick and choose and say, oh, take this little piece and this little piece there, or else it won't work. But that's the part that really has me most excited.
All right, and then finally, there's been some inferences made that the report does propose to raise taxes. So is that true?
It's a charge that I've been hearing for a few weeks, and it's just not true. Now, it is true that the governor had asked for the commission to consider um, funding mechanisms for the proposals that it makes, and there really wasn't the time frame that all this work had to be done, and didn't allow for all the steps you'd have to take before you'd even determine whether or not that was appropriate. So instead, what the report does is it lays out a series of things to consider. So yes, a lot of these things will add additional costs, but before you go back to the taxpayer, the first thing that you do is the same thing that any of our members would do in their business. If you got a new expense, something that they need to invest in or spend some money on to prop up or fix, the you've got to look at the priorities and optimization within your current resources. So that's the first thing we say is state government should before anything else, optimization and prioritization and efficiencies within their own spending is the first step. Maximizing federal resources, which in many cases we don't or we haven't in the past, um, to do this work is important. And then after or including or at the same time maybe as that is engagement with philanthropy in the private sector. Sometimes the government isn't the best answer to carry this work. Maybe this is something that is best. Some of this work is best done outside of government. So that engagement and catalyzing or utilizing and leveraging the private sector and philanthropy in order to achieve these objectives is another thing that ought to be on the table. After and only after those things, the report says that then the government should look at tax structures itself. So sometimes we have tax structures that say you can have extra over here and have a shortage over there, but the way the tax is structured is you can't, there's no flexibility. You still got to spend this money over here on the thing you don't need, and you can't spend it on the thing you need more because of the way that the tax policy is structured. So then government ought to look at the way that the revenue streams are structured. Does it get the money to where it is most needed, where the priorities are the highest? And then in a final step is that if after all of those things there's still some sort of a gap, well, sure, at that point, if there's a value proposition question to make that the government would have to make, and that is that here's a need. We've done all of these things, and by the way, I think especially with our membership, very practical people, that'll make sense. Like, okay, if we really did believe that the government went through all these steps, and this is a big priority, and there's some gap left, okay, let's talk about what that might mean in terms of taxes and fees and some other kind of government revenue. But the report decided not to predetermine after all that stuff what the need might be in the end, because in some of these things there won't be an additional need for revenue. In some cases there will be a need for additional revenue, but there's something else in government that is less important that they could not do and spend it here. So there's a series of steps. So if you do hear that this report proposes to increase taxes, it's true. In fact, the report, I think, goes out of its way to say it's not even appropriate to talk about that yet. There's a lot of work that would have to happen before determining whether or not that's an appropriate step to make. The other thing that I would mention on the report, just kind of a context that I wasn't really crazy about, but I think it's worth pointing out, is that it lists or it shows Michigan compared to other states as a low tax state. And there is evidence that they point to. They're not just making that up. But I do think it's important to expose that when you get into the math of how they're calculating that, they're just looking at the tax burden per person. And in Michigan, where we've been losing population, we have lower educational attainment and lower household income. That means that our citizens do pay less because they have less. They make less income and they buy fewer things than they would if they had higher income. So the report, what it says that we're a low tax state, taxes paid per capita, that might be true. But for a lot of our members who aren't, they're not like super wealthy where they get all the extra, tax advantages and, tax shelters and doing business in other countries and that sort of thing. They're not that big, but they're not low income and they don't get like refundable credits. So the ones have that solid middle class, our people, we're not necessarily a low tax state. So for them, so the report looks at that. The tax question causes low tax state because the taxes per capita are low, but it's because our people's income and household income are lower than other states.
All right, well, thanks for clearing that up a little bit for our members and viewers. All right, I want to talk now about electric vehicles. There's been some news lately that demand is down for electric vehicles and that production is being scaled back. And in fact, Ford made a specific announcement about one of their more popular products. So what are they changing?
So Ford, we talked about in the briefing before that they were scaling back the battery plant. That was the first kind of instance where it was like, wow, that's a big reduction in the size of the plant that they're doing in Marshall, the one that got the incentives, the renegotiating what the incentives will be. That that was the first sign, but they've also announced that the F-150 Lightning, so this would be the F-150, which is by far Ford's most popular product. They have an electric version of that. They're scaling back production by 50%. So it is an indication that not only with battery production itself, but naturally what would follow is scaling back on the production of the vehicles that use those batteries. And that's one that's here in Michigan that um, that I found to be noteworthy because it is, if there was any product of Ford's that could withstand economic ups and downs, it would be the F-150, the most which is just a very, very popular pickup, the most popular of pickups, I think, in America. So that in terms of sales, so it's an indication that the marketplace isn't quite as ready as perhaps the policymakers would like them to be.
All right, but then we have the governor who appears to be kind of trying to prop up demand for electric vehicles. And is she proposing anything?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The first was the state fleet. So the state has thousands of vehicles, and so there's an executive directive that said by 2030 that the state should convert the fleet over to all electric. So there was that. That was the first thing. But also, I think it was yesterday or the day before, the governor proposed and this would be the second time she's proposed it because it didn't make it to the legislature the first time, the a credit to add on top of the federal credit for buying electric vehicles. So here in Michigan, if you bought an electric vehicle, the state would give you I think it was a $2,000 credit, and if it was from an automaker that is unionized, then it would be $2,500 credit for a vehicle that is electric. So that's that's another, as there's Michigan's put a lot of eggs in this electrification basket, and appears to be at least a couple of early moves to try to stave off or change the conversation around the marketplace, kind of cooling off, if you will, on demand. Actually, I don't want to say that the market is cooling off. I don't think the sales of electric vehicles are declining per se. It's just that I think there was an assumption that they were going to really ramp up or shoot up, and that's just not happening.
Do you think that there's going to be a trend change there? Will this change
Yeah, well, will
significantly?
it work? I don't think that it will work. I don't think that the state, a couple of things. First of all, the state fleet, while it is pretty big, one of the bigger fleets that you'll find, among players in the state here, not enough to really move the needle on the type of production scale that we're talking about here. Now, the tax credit, which anybody could get, a couple $1,000 or up to 2,500, that is not insubstantial. But the reason I'm skeptical that that would make that big a difference is because it's an add-on to the federal credit, which is really big, $7,500. So there's already $7,500 federal credit, and if that's not propping up demand for electric vehicles, will the state adding on top of it change that enough? I'm kind of skeptical that it would. I think it's going to be important for automakers to figure out how to first of all, how to bring the cost down, because while the government will subsidize the purchase of the vehicle, they won't subsidize the maintenance of it, and replacement of a battery in many of these vehicles is more than replacement of an engine in a combustible, traditional combustible engine vehicle. So that is I think there's some practical things that technology has to catch up on, but then also the convenience factor. There are way more charging stations out there, but just the amount of time it takes to charge. There's just some technology that needs to catch up with the trends within kind of the government preferences of which way the industry goes.
All right, and finally, on Monday's show, we touched briefly on a new law in the EU related to artificial intelligence. So you promised to come back here today and provide a little more insight there.
Yeah, this is it's a it's the most comprehensive a, attempt in the world so far to try to for government to try to wrap its arms around artificial intelligence and some of the risks that would come along with it. So an example would be for if there was an image or a video that was made by artificial intelligence that would have to be disclosed, that it would just be a legal requirement, kind of like a campaign ad. Running for office, I approve this message, that sort of thing. Like those disclosures that something generated by AI would need to be disclosed. Now, here in Michigan, there was actually a proposal that a campaign ad that used AI would have to disclose that. But in the EU, it's broader than that. Just if AI was used is something that would have to be disclosed. What I found also interesting about it, it puts controls on how the government can use AI. So this idea of privacy protections, and government has access to certain information, and and right now there's limits. Like government has to know what they're looking for, at least the way the American government works. Government has to know what they're looking for to go out and find it. So in other words, they can't just uh, I say they can't. They're not supposed to go just like data mining to find something that somebody's doing wrong without any sort of compelling reason or evidence to get into somebody else's business. So artificial intelligence really changes the landscape on that and so there are major privacy concerns. Could without having any sort of probable cause, could AI systems kind of feed up, say, well, we're looking at all these data sets, and here's top 10 list of people that you need to go check out. And but here's the thing, here's where it gets really sticky, is because and where it'll be interesting to see which direction they go with implementation, because those sorts of analyses will make like fighting terrorism and finding potential threats, sifting through all this data, which now human beings have to get and interpret. That the human beings will still get and interpret, but artificial intelligence really could enhance that in a very positive way too. So those kind of judgment or value calls will be interesting to see in how um, they lay it out. So the part that will also be interesting is whether or not they're just essentially is it essentially a law that is just essentially making the point instead of the expectations, but it's wholly unenforceable. That'll be interesting too, like enforcing it on the government itself. I believe they could do that. But when it comes to the private sector stuff, in the digital world, when somebody doesn't have a physical presence somewhere, how do you really stop? Um, how do you stop some of these practices? So a lot of unanswered questions, but it is noteworthy to me that it's the first at kind of like a federal level, um, at a top level government um, um, space where they've really tried to get their arms around this. So more to come on that as it lays out, and of course we're watching closely here, both in our country and here at the state level, where there are, at least in a few narrow instances, some attempts to govern and control, get arms around, limit the risks um, artificial intelligence.
All right, well, thanks for continuing that conversation for us, Brian. And obviously, like you said, this will not be the last we hear about AI regulation. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will be back here Monday at 3 p.m.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.